Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Last time my video was on World War II, or the Great Fatherland War, and I decided to continue this series, especially in view of the 9th of May, the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II and the Russian victory. But there's so many happenings going on, so many important developments in the ongoing saga of the Russian-Ukrainian war and the attempted peace negotiations that I'm taking a pause from the series on World War II. And today I'd like to talk one more time about the issue of the hot issue of contemporary politics is the Russian-Ukrainian war and the attempts by President Trump to bring the Ukrainians and the Russians to the negotiating table. So the facts are quite clear, and I don't want to repeat them. They're all over the news. They're being repeated over and over by various commentators with a slight difference in accent. But the bottom line of all these reports is that the United States has produced its plan that is quite favorable to accepting President Putin's positions, but not all of them, not all of the territories Russia claims. And there are all kinds of other things that are in dispute, but nevertheless, there's a sense today that, and Lavrov, Prime Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, said that they're quite willing to accept is as a basis for negotiations. And of course, the other fact that everybody knows that is in the news is that President Zelensky rejected those. And so this is where we start. My main question today is, why is Zelensky rejecting this peace, and what are the arguments of those who support him in this decision? And what do they propose instead? What is the alternative, if there is any, to what Trump is trying to propose to do in achieving peace? So I start with those who are in favor, and there are quite a few. And in fact, for the first time in a long time, there appeared publicly political figures in Ukraine who propose to accept American proposals. And these are Klitschko, who is the mayor of Kiev, and also Arestovich, who used to be Zelensky's advisor, and now he's abroad because he's afraid to come back. But he's trying to position himself as a person who might actually play a role in the forthcoming elections, if there are any, and if there's any freedom to campaign. So these people basically argue the following: that the most important thing, echoing Trump, is to stop the war. And that would mean that Ukraine would save its sovereignty. It would remain a pretty large independent state. It would keep 80% of its territory. And one other argument, which is mentioned, they do mention, which others don't, is that the territory which is ceded is not Ukrainian territory. It is Ukrainian in terms of its legal status, but it's the population there in Donbass is Russian-speaking, and it identifies itself with Russia. And they voted to be in Russia in a referendum, Crimea in 2014, and same goes for Donbass. So, in other words, they kind of imply that this is not such a big loss in comparison to what could be gained in case the deal is signed. And of course, it also implies membership in the European Union eventually, even though they are ready to accept no membership in NATO. So that's what they argue for. Now, those who argue against, and I decided to check what are these arguments. I looked through the issues of Kiev Post, a newspaper. It's available in English as well. And this is what it is, full of articles, just full of articles against any deal that President Trump is offering. What are their arguments? Well, their arguments are quite old. In addition to Zelensky's official arguments that it's against the constitution, that it's against international law, that this is Ukrainian sovereignty, we have seen all this, and this could be rebuffed just as easily. Yes, it is an international law, but there were cases in Europe when there was a divorce between Czech Republic and Slovakia, between Montenegro and Serbia. So it's quite possible for and the Kosovo rebelled and there was a war about it. So it's quite possible to find a legal framework that Donbas can secede from Ukraine. If Ukraine can secede from the USSR, well, then Donbas legally can secede from Ukraine. So that's not the real issue, the legal arguments. The more important are the practical arguments they give, and the practical ones that are given, believe it or not, they say Ukraine is winning in the war. Isn't that amazing? Where in almost in the middle of 2025, the Russian army had been advancing non-stop for already about a year. True, the pace of advance is somewhat slow, but nevertheless, it is an advance, and yet they're saying that Russia is not going to be able to win the war. Ukraine is going to win the war because there are supposedly swarms of drones, because Ukrainian army is stronger, because it's bigger, and we have heard all these arguments before. So I group those arguments as military arguments that Russia is not winning, Ukraine is winning, and it's going to win. So that's the practical military argument not to sign the deal. Now, another one is that international argument, which means it's useless to sign with Putin because he's not going to honor it, because he's going to continue his aggression, because he's going to attack further on if you sign and give something to him, and you cannot accept aggression to be rewarded. This is the main argument of those in the coalition of the willing, Macron and Starmer and Denmark and the Baltic countries. So this is their argument. You cannot do appeasement. Now, their argument with appeasement sounds historically very convincing, but of course it's nothing. It's nothing of the sort. It's not the same thing, because what the Russians are trying to do is support countries that had already seceded from Ukraine. That they, in fact, Putin spent 8 years convincing Zelensky and and Poroshenko, president of Ukraine before him, to accept the legal status of Donbas as autonomous in Ukraine. So Russian aggression case falls apart immediately when you realize that it's the Russians who are trying very hard to have the Ukrainians keep Donbas, but provided with autonomy and legitimacy of the Russian language and Russian culture and a Russian-speaking population, which they refused. And they refused the Minsk Accords, and only then, when there was no other way to oppose integration into NATO and the absorption of the Russian-speaking areas into NATO-dominated Ukraine, that the special military operations began. So here falls apart this whole argument of annexation, aggression, etc. But this is not the important thing. The most important thing in explaining Ukraine's and Zelensky's posture right now is, as usual, domestic politics. And the domestic politics is very simple. The Ukraine basically cannot accept any loss of territory, because anybody who does this will be killed. And this you could see also on the pages of Kiev Post. They call it a revolution. So here's a very important point. Poroshenko was elected on the program of peace. Zelensky was elected on the program of peace. He promised that he would recognize Donbas autonomous. He's going to work out a deal with the Russians. And all of them, after a while, facing the threat of overthrow or actually killing, surrender to the right wing, to the nationalist Banderovite forces. And this is the mentality I want you to explain to. These people hate the Russians, who they call Moskali, so much. They're driven by hatred so much that they would rather lose the rest of Ukraine but not concede anything to the Russians. That's the point. They're driven by hatred which they cannot overcome. Even though rationally, as Trump pointed out, if they persist, they would lose American support, they would lose the financial and military support, and they would lose more territory. They don't care. As long as they can continue in their position of rejecting any deal as long as it is possible. Now, about the what to do then, how to act if the deal is rejected. And here was a very interesting article by Anders Aslund. He's an economist from Sweden. And I must admit here that I know him personally. In the 1990s, when I was a Harvard professor and I was working on my book in Moscow, he was there advising Yeltsin, and we met several times. And I know at that time he was ardent proponent of Yeltsin's reforms and everything, and now he's totally and completely against Russia, and he's giving advice to Ukraine how to survive and how to win. And this is what Aslund wrote in a recent articles. He said that Ukraine can win, and for that it needs to, and this is what he says: the West must provide complete air superiority to Ukraine over Russia. And I want to comment immediately on each of those proposals because they're so absurd. The West cannot, even if it wanted to, the entire NATO combined with the United States cannot provide air superiority to Russia. That's the problem, because Russia has the best air defense systems, and it has its striking aircraft, Su-57s and others that are equal or superior to the American ones, but let's say equal, not to upset American patriots. So to provide air superiority over Russia is impossible, Mr. Aslund. The next thing he says, that the West should provide a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Again, technically impossible. They cannot provide air-free zone, fly-free zone in Ukraine, simply because Russia has control over the skies, and its anti-missile defense and anti-aircraft defense is the best in the world. Now, it also says that the West should double down on financial support. And he says that in 2023, 2024, Ukraine got $100 billion from the West. And he says they should continue so. Well, I must disappoint it, Mr. Aslund. If you're an economist, you should know that nobody has this kind of money. Neither the United States can afford to put $100 billion for the next year. Neither does the European Union. Here he has a very clever trick. He says this money is easily available if they confiscate Russian assets. 300 billion, which supposedly should be good enough for another 3 years. And after 3 years, who knows, maybe Trump will be on the way out and the European unions are going to start their own arms production, and then they're going to be able to win the war. That's the plan. Now, to confiscate Russian assets is also impossible. If they do it, they will actually lose more money, because this is illegal by international law, and the conditions of their investment when they were put in these banks, if they break those, that everybody, all the world who is holding anything in European banks is going to withdraw it. And this is going to ruin their economies. So, Mr. Aslund, stealing Russian 300 billion is not an option, and the Europeans do not have their own money to replace the American ones. Now, he says Ukrainian army is 800,000 strong, and the Russian is only 700,000, that they're stronger. Total nonsense. It's exactly the other way around. He believes the figures of the Ukrainian general staff, and they're, of course, vastly exaggerated in terms of their victories over Russian armed forces and in terms of their casualties. The facts are that Ukraine is indeed running out of soldiers, and they're thinking of getting the 18-year-old boys into the army, and they wouldn't be doing this if they had plentiful of reserves. In fact, they're stretched so thin that some areas are not protected at all. And the reason that the Russian advance is so slow is for political reasons only. This is what I hear daily from the Russian generals. This is Putin's way of conducting the war. This is what he wants, and this is why it is so slow. When you see in Western screens that Russians attack civilian objects, this is of course not true, because they are military objects, and if you know what it is to attack civilian infrastructure, look at Gaza. That's what the Israelis do. This is what is called attacking civilian infrastructure. The Russians hit a restaurant or a library where there's a meeting of NATO officers. That's when unfortunately, a few casualties of surrounding areas and houses are occurring. So, Aslan's argument the Ukrainian army is strong is false, as all the other ones, and therefore it seems to me that this whole spectrum of arguments is designed to make the Ukrainians feel that they can win, and the Europeans actually are using them in their propaganda to prop them up so that they continue fighting, just as Americans did under Biden. And the conclusion, of course, is this is all self-destructive. It would only mean to harsher conditions. And the last word, Putin seems to be interested in coming to an agreement with Trump and using his platform, going out of his way to meet as far as possible American proposals. That's on one hand. On the other hand, when you listen to Putin's speech when he congratulated the armed forces on the liberation of Kursk province, the last words were onward to the complete destruction of the Kiev regime. So this seems to me that the Russians are beginning to be fed up with the sort of negotiating, not negotiating, accepting Ukrainian demands. They've come to a conclusion that they would have to go through the motion of negotiations, but they're trying to communicate to to Trump, that Zelensky is a problem, and the sooner they get rid of him and get a new government in Ukraine, the better, with whom one could do business and negotiate a settlement that might work. Thank you very much, and don't forget my next video will be on the Battle of Stalingrad, and I want to continue my mini-series on the Great Fatherland War and Russian victory. Thank you, goodbye, subscribe.